are following along in the Etz Chaim Chumash, we are on page 456. This is the beginning of Parashat Mishpatim. Mishpatim means rules or laws or something like that. And it's perhaps not the most descriptive name for a section of Torah, since so many of them contain rules and laws. But we are starting a sort of new chapter here, a new genre, if you will. Up till now, the Torah has largely been narrative, and we sort of transition into into more of a law code with last week's parsha at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai provides us an experience of receiving laws directly from the mouth of God. And now we're going to be receiving laws that come to us from Moses, and we're not really being given a context for it. So the assumption that you can make here is that these were given immediately after the Ten Commandments. You don't have to read it that way, and in fact, you could read it all sorts of ways. The important thing here seems to no longer be the narrative when we received these, where we were when we received these, what was our condition. Now the important thing is the rules themselves, the laws themselves, and so we're in a sort of transition moment in our Torah text, and there will be all sorts of narrative sections going forward. We're not done with the narrative, but we're moving our emphasis into Mishpatim, into laws and rules and this sort of thing. And so what is the very first one that we receive here? We could take a look on page 456, 457. These are the rules that you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. If he came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. If his master gave him a wife, and she has borne him children, the wife and her children shall belong to the master, and he shall leave alone. All right, so let's pause there. This is a section that, by modern standards, strikes us as fairly brutal. This isn't a feature of the society that we would want to be a part of, and in many ways, it stands in contrast to so much of the moral tone of what's come before, and it's left many to wonder why. What is going on here? Why is this the first set of rules that we're receiving after the revelation of Mount Sinai? Anyone have any thoughts about that?
Oh, what you said during the Dvar Torah yesterday kind of struck me in that we're entering a whole new being, so to speak, and structure, and this is the beginning of that structure. And taken from the standpoint of where they stood at that point in time, we don't know if there were any Mishpatim in their life before that, but this kind of makes it clear what the ideal structure of our society is going to look like. Mishpatim is slightly different than Hukim, isn't it? Aren't there different kind of gradients of rules and laws? And I'm forgetting which is which, but one has to do almost with civil code and
right. Well, there are a lot of ways you can divide the various mitzvot. You can do positive and negative. You can do, sort of from the Torah itself versus from the rabbis and their understanding, although the rabbis themselves tell you which ones are from the Torah and which ones are from the rabbis, so that gets a little tricky. And then you often see, mitzvot, mishpatim, and chukim. And the basic division there is that mishpatim sort of serve as national laws, as you mentioned, something akin to a civil code, not necessarily something that operates with a moral basis, although there is a moral basis, generally speaking. But I can't make for you a moral case for why the why the fine for running a stoplight ought to be $50 versus $100. I mean, at a certain point, you just have to kind of make a decision. You just kind of have to have a law on the books that says something, and it's not so much a law driven or determined by any sense of morality as much as it's just these are the standards that we all operate according to, and we all have a shared standard. The other way Mishpatim is often understood is that these are laws that wouldn't necessarily make sense if you didn't know the story. So and that might be an interesting clue to this little bit here in the beginning. So if I say to you, our society has a law, we don't murder. Well, sure, okay. I don't need to explain that any further. I think every society has that law. It's a bit of a chicken and egg, where you say murder means unjust killing. So okay, so by definition, every society is going to have a rule against doing things that you shouldn't do. But if I say to you we have a rule against murder, then that's just murder. So like that doesn't need any further explanation. But if I say to you we have a rule that you don't eat matzah, or you don't eat chametz rather, for 1 week out of the year, and you say, oh, that doesn't make any sense, and I say, no, it does make sense, because of this story, this exodus from Egypt that happened a long time ago. And then you presumably you would say, oh, okay, well, now that you tell me this story, now I get it. Now it makes sense. And that stands in contrast to chukim, which are rules that even once I tell you the story, they don't make any sense. Why is the cow okay to eat and the pig's not? There's no reason. There's really no reason. Some people try to come up with a reason. Some people try to say, oh, there's something in the spiritual realm, or they were created with different Kabbalistic hands of God, or the pig is trying to trick you with its split hooves. And I mean, there's a lot of midrashic explanations. But at the end of the day, there's some mitzvot that aren't given a reason and aren't going to have one. But these do, presumably. That's the idea of Mishpatim.
Rabbi, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay, two things. What is sort of a time frame? Is there any mention in the scholarly tracts or in scholarly writings, the people that have truly studied the order of the Torah, to say that this was like from P or E or inserted, because they needed to? What is the time frame actually that is surmised between the last parsha of the Torah and this new?
Okay, so that's a fabulous question. So the sort of classic interpretation that some scholars, I studied with a couple of different documentary and hypothesis scholars, and they have different points of view about this. But the sort of classic perspective is that at some point the J source and the E source were redacted together into some text that combined the two of them, JE, and that JE is then the one that is combined with P and D, and JE is very difficult to untangle once you get past the burning bush, because the whole point of the burning bush story is that God hasn't been using the name Yud-He Vav-He up until that moment. And so that's E source. That's what the E source says. So everything in the book of Genesis where God is using Yud-He Vav-He, is not the E source. But once you get past the burning bush, the names of God don't really change. And so it becomes impossible to untangle J and E. Now, one of my teachers, a great man, a humanistic rabbi named Semach Yore, he disagrees with that classic analysis, and he says even further into the book of Exodus, the E source doesn't use Yud-He Vav-He except at the burning bush story. So there's some disagreement about that. But regardless, this is definitely not P, and of course it's definitely not D. So this is somewhere from the JE cycle, which makes it an earlier layer. And you can tell that it's an earlier layer because similar mitzvot show up in Parashat Shoftim in the book of Deuteronomy, except there are differences, there are explanatory differences, because this text it leaves things a little bit unclear. And tell you what, how about we we'll get to that. We'll get to that. So I'm putting a pin in my mind about where this text is unclear. But I do want to come back to the question at hand, which is, having been liberated from slavery, having been freed from slavery, we then have this, the fancy term is theophany, the appearance of God. God shows up, God interrupts our regularly scheduled programming to give us a Torah, to give us the Ten Commandments. And then the very next thing that happens after that is a conversation about slavery. And the rabbis say, well, that can't be a coincidence. That has to mean something. There has to be something deeper here. When the first thing that happens after you free people from slavery is you talk to them about slavery. And I think a lot of us would have hoped somewhere in the back of our minds, we would have hoped to see, I'm the Lord who freed you from the land of Egypt. Your society will not have any slaves anymore. Well, that would have been nice, right? I mean, I think we would all agree, if we were writing a 21st century law code, we'd probably say no slavery. I hope we would agree with that. And so, from my perspective as a 21st century rabbi, I have to ask myself the question, why? Why doesn't the Torah ban slavery? Why does it permit slavery? It's interesting to note that my predecessors of previous centuries weren't especially concerned with that question. There's very little until the modern era in Jewish sources that questions the institution of slavery or problematizes it in any way. We see up until the Middle Ages, Jews own slaves. They are in the slave trade. If you've ever heard that Jews were responsible for the transatlantic slave trade, that is an anti-Semitic lie. Jews did not have a role, any substantial role in the transatlantic slave trade. But in slavery in the Middle Ages, Jews were very involved in that. This was, to the point where Maimonides actually says, when you're trying to teach your children about the Exodus from Egypt at the Passover Seder, a great way to do that is to point out your slaves, to say to the kids, hey kids, we were slaves. Like that guy over there, our slave who's serving us at the Seder. That was probably pretty instructive, actually. But from a moral perspective, it probably leaves us a bit wanting. And so, in modern times, people have sort of tried to dig back into this parsha specifically and say, what is Mishpatim teaching us about slavery? What can we glean from it? And I don't think it's too much of a reach to see here an implication that this is falling from the ideal, that the ideal would be that you wouldn't have slaves. The ideal is that everyone would live in a free society where everyone has, they have enough economic output to be able to take care of themselves and their families. But we see that sometimes that doesn't happen. And this is actually a very tricky question. To what degree does your personal autonomy give you the freedom to sell your personal autonomy? Can you sell yourself into slavery? Shouldn't I have that freedom? Shouldn't I have that right? In this country, the answer is no. But historically, over the centuries and the millennia, people did have the right, when they were destitute, when they didn't have anything else, to sell themselves. Obviously, no one wanted to be in that situation. But when it happened, the Torah is making clear here that it's a temporary arrangement. It's a temporary affair. You have the right to sell yourself for a set period of time. You don't have the right to sell yourself into slavery forever. or maybe technically you do have the right, but you really shouldn't. You really, it's behavior that's incredibly frowned upon. This is not completely irrelevant for our modern problems and modern situation, by the way. I mean, first of all, there is slavery still in the world. There's by some reports, more slavery now than there ever has been, even though it's illegal to call someone a slave, to buy and sell someone as a slave. But we see conditions akin to slavery, whether it's Indian factory workers who are unable to get out of their debt to the company store, which ends up getting passed from one generation to the next, or whether it's there are child sex slaves in Thailand who are born outside of the hospital and not given a birth certificate, and therefore they can't go to school and they can't get legitimate work, and so that problem ends up getting perpetualized throughout the generations. I don't know if you remember a couple of years ago, those kids were trapped in the cave in Thailand, and there was this huge rescue effort, and we all celebrated when they came out of the cave alive. Most of those kids were not citizens of Thailand, even though they were born there, because they were not born in the hospital and didn't have birth certificates. And so, slavery continues in all sorts of ways that aren't called slavery in this world of ours.
Rabbi, may I?
Oh, please go ahead. Please go ahead.
Is it possible along that thinking, at the time that this was addressed, were we actually, okay, the idea of people being destitute, times were hard, and people then did what was common practice at the time would be to sell themselves or go into an indenturement. Was it possible also that we were, as we were going through Canaan, I mean, is this concurrent with the time that we were occupying the lands or trying to conquer the lands, that there were battles, that there were skirmishes that were not actually written about, and that there would be, if you came across a village and you took them over, and then those people became slaves rather than murdering them because they were useful. Was this part of what was going on in the background? I mean, I'm trying to picture this. It seems like there's a whole chunk of time and social behavior. I mean, there was history here that's just not talked about or written about.
Yes,
I'm wondering if it's a speculation. I don't know.
Sure, no, it's really good speculation. Actually, we see in the Talmud this section gets expanded on quite a bit, and the one of the fundamental distinctions, if you look in verse 2 here, is when you acquire a Hebrew slave, the Eved Ivri, and so everything here is assuming that the slave that you have acquired is in some sense your countryman, someone who, they didn't use the term Jewish, but it would be a Jewish slave, and so that is setting aside the issue of slaves from other places, slaves who are not your countrymen. What do you do with them? How do you treat them? How long are you going to hold them in servitude? And so that's sort of an issue for another time. But what this text is dealing with, or at least in this part, is the question of the presumably free-born countryman and neighbor of yours, your friend down the street who's fallen on hard times. You grew up together, and now, like, oh, did you hear about Bob? He's selling himself into slavery. What is that? What does that mean? How do we understand that? How do we treat that person? And so the way we treat that person is that they are not allowed to sell themselves into perpetual slavery. They sell themselves into a 7-year period. And so we see he shall serve 6 years, and the 7th year he shall go free without payment. Now that's it's better than nothing. And actually, this country, the United States, was founded as a series of colonies in which this practice was a big part of our settlements. People who couldn't otherwise afford to take the boat ride across to the English colonies they would put themselves out as indentured servants. And you know, that's more or less what this is here. It's you're a servant, but you're not 100% free to leave. You can't just quit your job. And so you know, you're working for you know, room and board or something like that, and to pay off a debt. And so that appears to be what's going on here. I'll say one more thing, which is in the ancient world, this was a ubiquitous institution. There was no society that didn't have slavery of some sort in the ancient world. And the only question, the sort of debate was how long was someone a slave? What rights did they have as a slave? Could they get themselves out of slavery in some way? You know, this you know, it shouldn't surprise us to see slavery in an ancient text. You know, what became of their children is another interesting question. And we see some evidence of that question here. If he came single, he shall leave single. If he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. Okay, so what is this telling us? Who are we talking about here? Who are we not talking about here? When you acquire a Hebrew slave, what's a man?
They were beginning an agricultural society. I mean, again, I'm trying to think of what their economic activity, their major economic activities would be at that time.
Yeah, it was largely an agricultural society. There was, you know, some amount of craftsmanship going on, and you know, the text is very, you know, full of day laborers and that sort of thing. You know, the further on in the Torah, there's going to be a conversation about a sort of ideal society where every family has a piece of land, and at the end of 50 years, everyone gets their land back again. And so you can never become too destitute in a sort of intergenerational way. Everyone gets to press the reset button every once in a while, rich and poor alike. Whether that actually happened is an interesting question. There's very little evidence of it actually taking place. But that can problematize our question here. I'll get to that, but first I want to point out that that this text is only speaking about men. When you acquire an Eved Ivri, a male Hebrew slave, there's nothing here about the female slave, how long she is supposed to serve, what is her condition, what is her case. This is speaking about men. It says, if he had a wife, his wife shall leave with him.
So is this like the couple both were slaves, like the husband and wife are both slaves?
That seems to be the case. Yeah, that seems to be the situation. A husband and wife would sell both of themselves. That you wouldn't have a situation where their social status changed for one of them and not the other. And that's because legally, and I mean, you know, these aren't things I love saying, but it's true. Legally, in this social arrangement, the wife sort of operates as an extension of her husband. So whatever he is going through, she is going through, and she's not in a position to separate herself from her husband's condition. Now, what that means is, like, you know, let's say I do buy a female Hebrew slave. I don't have to follow this 6-year business. There's nothing in here about female slaves being released after 6 years. It would seem that the term of servitude for a female slave is perpetuity. And there appears to be an assumption here that that she is going to one way or another, she's going to become attached to a husband of some sort, and whatever his condition is will end up being her condition as well. Presumably, we'll see here. We'll see here in a little bit that there's some sense that perhaps the husband can free himself and later free his wife and children through his labor. He could buy his wife's freedom. Up until the Middle Ages, by the way, that was not especially uncommon. We have a fascinating use of this text. I could give a whole class just on this, and so I'll try to do the short version. But elsewhere, our Torah speaks of people born illegitimately, which doesn't mean outside of the bonds of marriage. It means they're born as a result of adultery or incest or something like this. And in Hebrew, they're called a mamzer. And being born a mamzer is a terrible, terrible condition because that status gets passed on forever. That status never goes away. And so the rabbis were keen to try to figure out ways to make people not be mamzerim because it's just terrible. It's just, once you're a mamzer, you're stuck that way. Your children are stuck that way. No one wants to marry you. And so when one of the things that they would do, this was an Italian Jewish practice. I have a special affection for Italian Jewish customs because they're so clever. There was such a smart, engaged community. And there weren't so many of them. These were small little Jewish communities, tiny little synagogues up and down the country. But they did really interesting things. And one of the things that they would do is that if there was a mamzer who couldn't marry I don't know how you call it, a legitimately born Jewish woman, what they would do is they would have him marry a slave. And so he would marry a slave, but actually it wasn't technically a marriage. Technically, he was purchasing her. Now the rabbis frown on this. They say you shouldn't you shouldn't purchase a woman, a female slave, to have sex with her. But the Italian custom was to do this as a loophole to get around the issue of mamzerut. So the mamzer would marry a shifcha, a slave, a female slave. Their children would be born into slavery, and then he would free them. And by freeing his children from slavery, he also freed them from the stain of mamzerut. So this was how the Italian Jewish community would deal with that issue. It's an interesting, it's a really potentially useful halachic loophole, except we don't have slavery anymore. So I think you could ask the question, could you do this as a loophole with someone who called themselves a slave, even though legally you're not allowed to have a slave? That's beyond, I think that's beyond my rabbinic ability to determine that. But it's an interesting problem and an interesting use of this text. And every indication we have is that these were loving marriages. These were there's no particular abuse in these sort of marriages. But yeah, so I think it's safe to say that we're going to be uncomfortable in this conversation, and I'm uncomfortable. This is my holy text. This is something I derive a great amount of personal meaning from, and at the same time, this is not a section that I look to for a lot of my spiritual enlightenment.
Well, you were saying, actually, Rabbi, you were saying before about how, like, really it wasn't until the modern era that Jewish sages had anything to even say about it, which really goes to show how much slavery was just taken for granted as that's just the way things are.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't really until the Industrial Revolution that you see a great amount of pushback on the institution of slavery. And a cynic would probably point out that we didn't really notice how bad slavery was until we had an alternative to it, until we had other ways of deriving energy, until we figured out that you could build a steam engine and this sort of thing, and you could get a lot of the work done without slaves. Then suddenly slavery looked really bad. But up until then, we were sort of willfully ignorant. We were willfully blind, morally blind to this terrible institution.
In footnote 4 to, I mean, in in line 4 about, right, they're being specific. In 3, if they came single, they'll leave single. If they had a wife, his wife shall leave with him. But only in that, circumstance. But then in 4, it says again, it says, if in Etayim, footnote 4 down there.
Hmm?
In the ancient Near East, it was common practice for a master to mate a slave with a foreign bondwoman solely for the purpose of siring houseborn slaves. The woman and her offspring remained the property of the master. So it was not necessarily the slave owner having the relationship with a bondwoman, but could take that single man, presumably that single man, and mate that single man with a foreign bondwoman. Not necessarily, it seems like a Hebrew woman was excluded, but then they became the property. They were retained as the property.
Right.
And the
So
single
there-
and yeah, I don't know.
that note is useful, but it's sort of taking us down a path that is not especially likely if I'm sort of trying to think of the odds in my mind.
It's kind of the model for the Southern slavery there. I mean, really, our Southern heritage of slavery was not that far removed from this kind of these edicts or these rules or these laws.
Oh, no,
Except
not
that
at all.
Race was the bigger part of it. We had
Yes, absolutely.
we had the obviously other to enact this.
Right. And how you found yourself in a position to own your own children as slaves and to not see a problem with that. It's shocking. It doesn't speak well for the human condition. It doesn't speak well for human nature. Thomas Jefferson, when he went to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, the law in Pennsylvania at the time was that you were allowed to take one slave with you into Pennsylvania, even though it was a free state. You could sort of have a temporary slave with you if you were coming from the South. And he brought his half brother to be his slave to serve him while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. So while Thomas Jefferson was writing, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. His half brother was back in the hotel, cooking his meals and serving him and doing everything that a slave would be expected to do. It's the blindness, the moral blindness inherent in this, where it's not even, maybe that's not even a word I should use, but the sort of willful ignorance where you say, I just don't see this. I just can't see how terrible this is. From a modern perspective, it's shocking, and this is probably one of the most disturbing texts in the Torah. This and probably some of the issues around women as well. But this is where we reach a moment where we say, surely this can't be the end of our conversation. And thank God we're not fundamentalists. This doesn't have to be the end of our conversation. This is the beginning of our conversation. Oh, Steve, please go ahead.
Okay, so this is pretty deep. This is it for me too, but so I have a question, and then I'm going to sort of make a comment question. But so I mean, we're talking about this as far as what it says here in the Parashat. But what does Talmud say about this? Okay.
Steve, can you use the
That's
mic,
a great
please?
question. I'll repeat Stephen's question. So the question was, where does the Talmud go with this? And the answer is, if you could believe it, is quite a lot. There's quite a lot that the Talmud has to say on this issue. So, well, we'll just take a look at a specific example here. And this is what I wanted to circle back to, where we have this is probably an earlier text, an earlier version of the Torah text that gets laid down to us. And then it sort of gets problematized later. So if you look at verse 2, it says, "When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. In the 7th year, he shall go free without payment." Now that might remind us a little bit of the Shemitah year, where you do a thing for 6 years, and then on the 7th year you rest. And then we have sort of like the Shemitah of Shemitahs, where after 7 Shemitah cycles, we have the Jubilee year. And in the Jubilee year, one of the features of the Yovel, of the Jubilee year, is a resetting of debts. Families get their land back, and slaves are freed. And so how do you line up this with that? It's not obvious. It's not evident in the text itself. If I say he shall serve 6 years, in the 7th year he shall go free, does that mean in the 7th year of the Shemitah cycle? So if we're in the 5th year of the Shemitah cycle and I buy a slave, I have to let him go, in like a year and a half? Or is this a personal count? Does every Hebrew slave have a personal count of 6 years? And so, like I say, it's not obvious in the text itself. And so that's one of the things that the Talmud comes to deal with. And they do side with it being a personal clock. So every Hebrew slave has 6 years of service, and then in the 7th year they are freed.
How does it deal with the topic and subject of women as slaves?
So that's a great question. So in terms of women as slaves, the Talmud is so it. How the Talmud deals with women in general is a tricky question. It's very clear that the authors of the Talmud were living in a fundamentally sexist, patriarchal culture. They took a lot of that on for themselves, and they were very interested in things that we are not necessarily interested in. And even within, we're not talking about like by the 1960s or something. This is a couple hundred years later, people are saying, we don't understand what they're talking about. We don't worry about these things like they worry about. We don't worry, we don't consider it sinful for a man to look at a woman's clothing that's drying on the line outside her house. But in the Talmudic time, they did, because they had a very strong gender separation. And so some of these things quickly become bizarre and irrelevant. But one of to get back to your question, the assumption that they seem to operate with is that a female Hebrew slave is not likely to have a status separate from her husband for all that long, because she's likely to be married pretty quickly. And there didn't seem to be any stigma on marrying a slave. There didn't seem to be any stigma on marrying your son to a slave or something like this. And this is also, you have to remember, in the context of polygamy. So it wouldn't be all that uncommon if you could afford slaves, you could probably afford to have more than one wife. And so it was fairly common to marry your slave. So common that the rabbis argue not to do it, and then other rabbis say, well, yeah, but you can't really stop people from doing it. I don't think we should sugarcoat this. Being a free woman in a marriage in a patriarchal culture like this wasn't especially different from being an indentured servant. It was not a pleasant social atmosphere. I'm glad that I don't live in that environment. Especially glad that I'm not a woman living in that environment. And our society has progressed in all sorts of ways. And as much as I love our tradition and I love our traditional texts and our traditional way of life, there are things I'm very happy to let go of, things I'm happy to have moved beyond. And yeah, so the assumption here very much is that this text is speaking about a man, and a man has agency, and even a slave here has some amount of agency that a female slave doesn't have. And so a male slave, we'll just look at verse 5 here. If a male slave declares, "I love my master and my wife and children, I do not wish to go free," his master shall take him before God. He shall be brought to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall then remain his slave for life. So he has an option here to decide that he's going to be a slave forever. It seems to be frowned upon. I mean, we're like punching a hole in his ear. That's not something that you do just for fun. Maybe some people do, but I think the implication here is that you shouldn't want to be in this situation. You shouldn't want to be in this condition. But he at least has the choice. He at least has the ability to say, I'm done with this. 6 years, I'm done. I'm walking away.
I find that very strange, that whole bunch of.
Oh, it's weird. Yeah, it's very weird. It seems to be we're sort of branding him or marking him in some way. So this you can see in the note here on before God. So Ela Elohim is how we say it in the Hebrew, and that very well could mean before God or before the judges. It's a legal thing. It's something that's happening in a legal context. It's not a personal thing that's happening. You have to go to court. You have to go to the judge, the priests, the prophets. These are not especially distinct positions in biblical Israel. And you need to, this is you gotta go and get everything stamped and signed, and it's a legal transaction.
Can I hear?
Oh, please go ahead.
This thing only bothered me today because I was reading this morning an article in the Wall Street Journal about the war on drugs and the law, the act was signed by Nixon in 51 or 2 years later. But I was thinking about how this sort of relates to what we're talking about now. Because when you were a slave, okay, there was no social network, no services back then. When we were slaves in Egypt, okay, we were slaves, and then one day we weren't. But there was no counseling, there was no structure in place, no support system in place to help you get through the horrible experience that you might have had as a slave.
Right.
And then we punish you further because we're going to make you wander in the desert for 40 years,
Right.
and we're not going to let you see Eretz Israel. Okay, but that was one type of slavery. But the slavery that we experience today, we experience people who are drug addicts, okay?
Right.
People who are trafficked. Okay, these are situations of slavery that we don't really do a good job dealing with. Okay, so how can we look to this and then look to the Talmud to find guidance in how we're going to address that? Okay, because you can't just cut a drug addict loose after 6 years and say, okay, you're free. Okay?
Right.
Or somebody who's trafficked. So what do we do now?
This is true. And Steve, this is a fabulous point you're making here. That like what we're seeing here could be not exactly a social services program, but a way that someone who was destitute, someone whose condition had brought them into slavery, it could be here that this is the way to sort of bring them up and out of that situation. And we see in the text of the ancient world that being a slave is not actually the lowest social position. It's not the thing that people were terrified of, that, this is, things are going to go very badly and then I'm going to be a slave. They were actually more terrified of being poor and free, that being in a position where you were absolutely destitute, where you were starving, and there was no social support. slavery was a form of social support. It might be not a very good form, but to be a slave meant you had rights as well as responsibilities within a structured system. And we see here an opportunity to bring people out of that system as well. So it could be that this is better than the alternatives, and it could be for us a reminder, as you mentioned, that so many people in modern situations, whether they have been victims of human trafficking or whether they're victims of their own drug addiction, many people are slaves to one thing or another in our society, and would need our help to be brought out. They can't simply be let free. They can't simply be let out because not everyone's in a position to take care of themselves, and we all need help sometimes.
That is sort of a testimony to the Jewish tradition of how our social safety nets and all the institutions and support organizations evolved to address the needs of those who had more difficulty in navigating life and all of the circumstances, personal and private and socially, economically, all that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Attempts, but
absolutely. I do want to, we're running real low on time, but I want to get to this next bit here, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. So verse 7, when a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not be freed as male slaves are. So that's clarifying our situation here. If she proves to be displeasing to her master, who designated her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. He shall not have the right to sell her to outsiders, since he broke faith with her. So the pretty clear implication here is that when you sell a woman into slavery, when you sell your daughter into slavery, you are selling her to be something like a concubine or something like that. So this is a fundamentally unequal relationship. All marriages were unequal back then, but this is probably more unequal. And so you're selling her to be the concubine of this particular person. So her owner, her master, is not allowed to get sick of her and sell her to someone else. He's not allowed to change the terms of the relationship. He is bound to them as much as she is. And this is something akin to a marriage. It might not be a very good marriage, but it is something closer to marriage than sort of chattel slavery of the 19th century was. It says, if he designated her for his son, he shall deal with her as is the practice with free maidens. So if you buy a slave for your son to marry, you're essentially buying him a wife who is free to act like any other wife in Israel. If he marries another, he must not withhold from this one her food or clothing or her conjugal rights. If he fails her in these three ways, she shall go free without payment. So this is sort of laying out the rules for female slaves, which I think it's safe to say we wouldn't want to be in one of these situations. But there are, in this scenario, there are rights as well as responsibilities. And this does seem in many ways more akin to arranged marriage and sort of patriarchal concubinage than slavery as we knew it in early modern times.
I keep thinking of the producers. Isn't there the part of the redemption? I forget. One of them wanted to marry one of the women and had to redeem. I forget the exact circumstance, but
right. I can't remember that either.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting idea here. Also, I sort of skipped over that. You must let her be redeemed, which is to say that if there appears to be in some circumstances an option to buy someone back. And we see that in the book of Ruth and in other places. The right of redemption is part of the system of slavery here. All right, so this was a tough conversation. I don't relish talking about these things, but it is important If there's one thing I hope you'll walk away with, it is the knowledge that unfortunately these are issues that remain relevant today, and there is work to be done. The oldest nonprofit in the world, Slavery International, based in London, and they still do important work today. And this is still an issue that should be on our radars. And with that, I'll wish you Shavua Tov, and thanks for coming, everyone.